trying new positions or bringing in sex toys or proposing a threesome.
But I'm hearing every time more and more women who are not satisfied with the frequency want more, and men do not. And that has been a surprise to me.
What are you thinking and not saying, or feeling and not saying? And what, I don't know, maybe it will make you laugh, or maybe it will make your partner laugh if you actually did share some of those things.
Welcome to the Me and Us podcast, a conversation between two relationship therapists who talk about real-life issues based on what they learn in a clinical setting, working with clients, and from their own experiences of motherhood, marriage, and parenting.
Welcome to the Me and Us podcast. Today, we have episode Sex, Part 3, the pressures to initiate, reject, and orgasm. So we're going to unpack what it means to be in the role of initiator and rejector and talk about all kinds of things related to climaxing and experiencing the height of sexual desire, the orgasm. So when I think of initiating or rejecting and even having an orgasm, I first wonder, where do we learn how to do any of this? When it comes to initiating and rejecting, is this something that is part of our personality, our character, that determines what we naturally tend to do? Or can it be a role we learn to inhabit depending on the relationship dynamic we are in? Do gender and societal roles influence what we do when it comes to initiating and rejecting intimacy? And how does this conversation change when, the conversation changes to same-sex couples? So the relational anxiety from the pressure to do something, if that's initiating, rejecting, or climaxing, is an action or a response that is required in a sexual relationship. I'm Dr. Olivia, and with me is Elsa. And I guess my first question to you, Elsa, is what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of initiating, rejecting, and orgasm?
Hello, everybody. And that's a great question. I think the first thing that would come to mind right now is something along the lines of like tension or relational pressures and anxiety. I don't know if my answer is now influenced because I'm a clinical therapist, and the people that I talk to about this often are people that are experiencing these dynamics with some sense of pressure and anxiety. I do also talk about this with friends sometimes, and it can be a lighter conversation, but also not. I think it is very easy to have these conversations from the lens of anxiety.
Does it always come up as a form of pressure?
I mean, I think so. I think so because what I have found that ends up happening as relationships mature and get serious is that initiating and rejecting end up being roles that people fall into. It is not so often that I see relationships where it's like very even, where like both initiate kind of evenly, where both reject evenly. It oftentimes happens that one person wants it more than the other. We've talked about this in our previous episodes about sex. And if you kind of get stuck there and one-dimensional, it starts like pinning you down on that role. And both of them, by the way, I think come with like a lot of burden and a lot of responsibility. It's easy to not initiate and reject effectively, if you will. And also like once orgasming or not becomes a problem, and I use air quotes, the fact that it's a problem makes it an anxious process, which I already think it is inherently. And so it just becomes a conversation very centered around anxiety, in my opinion. It's not always the case, but it's probably if you're not having trouble with this, you're not coming to talk to me in the setting of couples therapy, you know?
Or it doesn't come up because I don't think many couples or most couples come in directly with sort of this issue or coming in about sex per se. But I think it does sometimes come up. But I equally think oftentimes it tends to work for couples. I hear couples talk about being comfortable with their role, and that they say, yeah, I'm comfortable in the initiating role, or in, the one who is more to reject, right? If or turn the other person down. But I agree. I think in general, it's a role we have to take on if we're going to have some form of intimacy, right? Is to initiate and turn down or reject.
Yeah, I was thinking about how probably in the beginning of a relationship, there's like a hormonal process, and this is obviously a generalization, but at first it's like it's almost a given that maybe both people want it at the same time, or there's this tension in the pursuit that makes it, I don't know what the word is, maybe like lighter or not an issue.
Or you just want sex all the time, right? I mean, you're
Yeah,
just so into each other that it doesn't.
maybe because you're waiting and playing the game, you have a rule, you don't do it until the third date, or but it's
It's
kind of like
effortless. It's more. It doesn't take that much work, but I do think as the relationship goes on, it takes more work, right? And you also have stressors that come into the relationship. I think stress is a big one, right? Being tired, where then it becomes more important. It's like, who's going to make the effort to initiate intimacy?
yeah, I did, and I think that's what I was kind of thinking. Like initiating and rejecting is easy when things are going well, when the relationship is new, but initiating and rejecting can be really difficult. Things are hard, when you're overtired, when there's stressors, when life is happening, when time has passed. And so it's, I think, something that doesn't get enough attention. I don't think that it has to be a problem, but I think it becomes a problem because we don't think about it too much. We kind of get comfortable in our little box, in our little role.
It's almost automatic. And I was thinking too, when we think of initiating, for example, my first thing is like initiating sex or touch or connection. But I think there's so much more to initiating. Let's say in terms of trying new positions, or bringing in sex toys, or proposing a threesome. I think those are all forms of initiating as well that maybe we don't think of, but I think are really important too, of like, how do you keep your sex life exciting and active? And does it take a form of initiating versus just getting stuck in, the same monotony?
Yeah, I love that. So it's like a commitment to be creative and to bring in, dynamic layers to your sex life. It makes me think of previous conversations we've had about like even like bringing in masturbation, or bringing in porn, or bringing in sex toys, all of which we've discussed before. But I think when I'm thinking about initiating, I'm also thinking about all the different stages of initiating. And sometimes, I hear a lot of couples talk about like differences. And this can, addressing your comment about gender, I often find that men are like, I can just have sex or not have sex. Women will be more like, I need there to be an emotional connection. I need there to be conversation before I can do that. So I think that the story of when we're initiating starts before you are basically saying, let's have sex, or do you want to get naked? So it, like, I think initiating and rejecting needs to be looked at what's happening before you are about to have sex. Like, did you have a good day? Do you feel connected to your partner? Have you paid attention to what they're going through, to their stressors, etc.? So it's kind of like paying attention to what's happening in the dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This makes me think of, so I have two thoughts on that. And one makes me think of sexual desire. Do men have more sex drive than women? How much of it is biological, and how much of it becomes part of the relationship dynamic, right? Of when you say do you feel a sense of desire, before you even initiate? Because I think sometimes, and I think I read this somewhere about women, that sometimes women need they don't feel a desire just thinking and looking at their, significant other. They need to get into it by either physically being touched, or they have to sort of get their engine working to get in the mood. So it's not like you have a desire before where you say, oh, I'm so I'm just in the mood, let me I'm going to initiate. I think sometimes, for women at least, and I will say for myself too, there has to be sort of a mood, or there has to be something happening for me to get in the mood, right? That maybe would lead to initiating.
Absolutely. Our brains are wired differently, and we need that change in context from like mothering and day-to-day activities and caring for others to be able to get into a mood and a setting where we're kind of caring for ourselves and connected to our partners, like leaving out the rest of the world. I do think it's a little bit of a mental game. I think all of this is a mental game, but one thing I wanted to say is that I have found recently that there are a lot of women who want higher frequency than men. In my clinical practice, it's a conversation that comes up. I think that what women need to be in the mood is very much what we're talking about. Like, is there a mood? Is there an emotional connection? That, I think, from my experience, again, has still held true. But I'm hearing every time more and more women who are not satisfied with the frequency want more, and men do not. And that has been a surprise to me. And I know my clients are like, is it normal? And I'm like, well, I don't know that there's such a thing as normal, but definitely I think there's like—
How do you account for that? And what are men up against when women want more sexy time?
Well, I think a lot of anxiety. I think what I was going to say is that culturally, I think men have been depicted as the ones who always wanted more. I think that's quite accurate. And when that shifts, it starts playing with everybody's mind. I think the woman feels very undesired. So this comes back to initiating. If it's a woman who's initiating, and you're initiating from a point of my frequency, desire isn't being met, what is it telling the man? Like, are you not manly enough? Are you not good enough? And what is it telling the woman? Are you unwanted by your man? And when this dynamic sets itself up, it's troublesome. Have you seen that happen?
I have certainly seen that happen, yes. And it just made me think of, what is it like for the man to have to turn down a woman or reject a woman if they're not so familiar in that role? And also, like, is that, it's like men are supposed to initiate. Men are, supposed to pursue the woman, right? And I think generally we think that's true, but I don't always think it's the case. But I was thinking of the emotions that come with when you initiate. What does it take to have to initiate? Does it take courage? Does it take,
I love that observation.
And for rejecting, I think of guilt. I think of feeling feeling bad about turning down your partner, and that's a whole thing, a whole process you have to sit with. And if you're constantly the one who's rejecting, then you're constantly stuck in that, right? Of having to, you struggle with, guilt of feeling, that's, what am I doing? I shouldn't be doing this. I should say yes. And it's, I think for both, it's a whole world of.
I agree completely. I think that when you look at the individual pinned down into a role, it can very much feel that way. Like, I'm the one being courageous and constantly rejected, and the one who's rejecting is constantly feeling guilty. But also, those dynamics really can get established quickly. But that's, I guess, the whole point I was thinking about when thinking about this topic, which is we are missing the perspective of looking at this from the relational dynamic, which is if your relationship is connected, if you are able to have proper conversations, then hopefully initiating shouldn't mean that much courage. It should mean a safe place where, like, when I'm initiating, I'm also considering the fact that the other may not want to, and that would be okay. And if I can be considerate of my desires and the other person's desires, maybe being rejected wouldn't feel as personal. And the same for the person who rejects. If I'm considering the other person and I can kind of say, not now, but I will initiate once I'm ready, or like, today I had a tough day, but I know you need this, so let me come give you a hug, which I know is not a replacement for sex. But if you maintain the focus on like the connection and not just like a plain rejection, like I don't want you, I think couples can get through this. And I think that's what I work on with clients, which is like, how do we find effective ways to initiate and reject so that it's not one versus the other, but the two working towards a healthier sex life.
So you're saying to really improve the communication around the words we use when we either initiate or reject, right? And I think in a perfect world, couples could converse like that, but I think often it doesn't happen. And I think there is a lot of anxiety around that too, right? Around being intimate and being sexual, even if you have known your partner for a long time. But I agree. I think there are very open conversations. I think it does take a lot of self to be able to say, no, I love you, but right now is not the right time. Or, extend an invitation for a different form of comfort or intimacy, right? And I think
I love that more than a hug, more than just a hug. You
can replace it with a hug. I just want a hug. Let's just snuggle, right? That's another thing that I hear so often is that when one person, makes that attempt to get close, right? And if that's either with a back rub or, a kiss or touching, and the other person immediately goes to, oh, this is going to mean sex. I don't want that. I just want to snuggle, and that can sometimes just be a miscommunication, right? Of how do you communicate, or how do you experience the in-between and not think it's immediately, we're just going to go jump into bed, right?
Which makes me think about orgasms, okay? I have found that a lot of what makes people not want sex and reject is their insecurity over being able to have an orgasm. For example, if I'm not able to have it, if I am not certain that I can climax, then I rather orgasm, because we sometimes give a lot of importance to orgasms. And, it's interesting, but I have found orgasms can be kind of like an unfair metric. Orgasms and just erections, right? For men, like it's obvious, like it's either up or not. And you either came or you didn't. And there's a very obvious and visual way to know that. For women, it's different, okay? So like you could potentially have sex and not be turned on. I'm not advocating for this necessarily, but you have that, I guess, I don't want to say to your advantage, but you could, right? And you could also pretend you had an orgasm and not have had it. Again,
I was having the same thought. I was thinking for this topic that men, if we speak of physical arousal, for men, you see it, it's there, and it automatically may also put more pressure on a man to have to initiate, right? And women can disguise it much more. They can, moan, they can touch, they can be into it, they can use their words. I think the one sign of a woman being aroused is wetness, right? Is she wet? But you can also use, you can use saliva for that. You can use gel for that. You can, find ways around it. And yes, like you said, women can fake orgasms, right? How would you know?
This is a lot of performance anxiety for men, where in that perspective, it gives women a little freedom. But because it gives women a little freedom, women can find themselves not prioritizing orgasms enough. Like maybe it's just easier to, oh, okay, pretend I came and that's it. Right. So
Well,
like it's tricky because our physical differences influence a lot the way that orgasms can either like work to our favor or not, if that makes sense. I think men have
well,
an easier time in this, again, general, but men can have an easier time just having an orgasm than women. And so there's an expectation that they do. And what happens when they don't, which is a really obvious moment. For women, there's, I guess, just a little more freedom. But with that freedom, then are you prioritizing your climax enough, if that makes sense?
and if you think about women having the ability to climax multiple times in a row, right? And somehow maybe not prioritizing that enough during sex, I think is, do women have more orgasms or do men have more orgasms having sex? And why do women not prioritize that more? I think there is a reality that, there's a large percentage of women, I think maybe even 80% of women that cannot have an orgasm during intercourse. I think that's a fact. That's reality. Women deal with that. But there are certainly ways around that, you would think, right?
Yes.
Using a vibrator, using touch. But is it prioritized enough?
Because
I don't know.
again, that goes back to initiating. If I
speaking
initiate
up.
bringing a vibrator and essentially, masturbate during our intercourse, how does that make the man feel? And I come back to like how much we're taking personal as opposed to prioritizing the relationship. Like, is a better dynamic one where the couple can prioritize both people's orgasm, even if that means that you use a vibrator for the woman, for example, or is the better one the one where like, the man can give the orgasm and you pretend that you had it sometimes or just didn't have it and he feels unable to provide it. And you feel like you're giving.
I think oral sex can be a replacement if women can't have an orgasm during sex, which can be done before sex to, really arouse the woman. I mean, I think that is certainly practiced a lot. But are we saying that women do not prioritize themselves enough to initiate having an orgasm during sex?
And some don't, but I think generally it's more common that the man will certainly,
So there's this idea and expectation that men should have an orgasm or sex is not complete. And maybe in both eyes, right? In the woman and in the man's eyes.
And pressure. Yes, from both.
Yeah, from both.
I think it is a bigger issue for both men and women when the man doesn't come. Again, because it's so measurable and obvious and everything that means.
Right. Because what does that mean for the woman too? Right? Or the man. If it's, if we're talking about same-sex couples, if the man doesn't orgasm, what does that say about the woman?
Yeah.
I think women may struggle with that, of thinking, oh, I didn't please him enough, or he's, he couldn't.
He's not into me.
He's not into me. He doesn't, right? I mean, I think those are things that happen and may explain why, if we're talking about gender, men tend to initiate more. I'm not saying always. I think there's lots of gray areas in this, but that men may be viewed as pursuing more than women.
Yeah, and as we kind of prepare for our questions, the thing I'm thinking about is like, how do you effectively mitigate the things that cause anxiety in your relationship and your sexual experience with your partner. And, what I mean by that is if somebody's having a hard time climaxing and having an orgasm, can you have a conversation where like you talk about like, what does sex mean to us apart from just the orgasm? Like, is it okay that we start sex and don't finish it, again, quote unquote, like that there is no orgasm for you or me, or that sometimes there will be and sometimes there will not be? And I think if there is room for this to genuinely be the case, I think anxiety comes down, and I think that the willingness to initiate and reject goes up. Like there's more freedom and flexibility because there is less pressure to climax.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about, all the things that are left unspoken during sex. What do men think during orgasm? What do women think or feel? How much of that is actually verbalized between couples? And I was also thinking, what are the thoughts during sex and climaxing versus masturbation? What changes in your feelings and in your thought process when you're doing that together or alone?
So interesting, physically and mentally, because I don't think orgasms are the same. So interesting.
So much. I mean, there's just so much more to talk about. We do have to get to our questions.
Okay.
You want to start, Elsa?
Okay. So my first question, and I'm going to have everybody thinking in terms of numbers. I think they're useful. What percentage of importance do you give orgasms in your sexual experience? So, again, like, is it 100%? Like, if I didn't come, that was terrible sex. Or is it not important at all? Like, oh, I'm used to not coming. That doesn't matter. So just kind of getting clear on what that percentage is and kind of asking yourself if you'd like to adjust it. So if you give it too much importance, how do you shift to kind of give other parts of the sexual experience more importance? Or how do you make it a priority if it has no percentage at all?
That's a very interesting question. And I was thinking, I don't think sex is as important to everybody. I think for some, it's super important, which may mean, okay, having an orgasm is a priority, right? Where others, I think, and maybe that has to do with a person's sex drive, hormonal imbalances, where they sort of don't prioritize it as much, right? It becomes more of a thing to maintain the connection in the relationship, right? Because I do think when couples, even if they don't orgasm, simply having sex or physical contact brings down the anxiety in the couple, right? So it's not necessarily, but having that time together, coming together, I think is important for couples.
Yeah.
Orgasm or not.
One thing I thought about is that in certain cultures or religions, like sex is for having children, not for pleasure. Like, damn you, if you want to make it about pleasure. So there's a lot of factors that make this such an interesting conversation.
Yep. I have a question. What's the story of your best orgasm, visually and descriptively? I just am so curious about what happens in your mind and what do you see? Do you close your eyes and have some sort of visual story picture? Is it always the same? Is it the same pattern? Is it different when you climax alone versus with your partner? What if you had to describe that and visualize it? What would it be if it's either happened or if you hope for it to happen?
Right. If there's a discrepancy between how you imagine it to be and what the ones you've actually had. I love that question. And also, like, how did you get there? Like, when you think of that story, and it was the best, what made it so? Like, what happened before, what happened during, what happened after? Oh, very cool.
Yeah, I don't hear enough about this stuff. I don't know. Maybe I'm not reading the right magazines, but I think these are not things that we just talk about, and not even with our partners. And here you are, having these experiences, and there's this whole experience that each one has.
Yeah.
That it's just fascinating.
Wow. Okay. Another question on my end is if you can scale from 1 to 10, 1 being like terribly ineffective to 10 being very effective, scale your effectiveness in rejecting and initiating based on relational success. Like, does it actually work for your relationship? Because maybe you're like, yeah, I'm really good at it. I can say no without a problem. But like, is that way that you're saying no actually working for your relationship? So I'll kind of self-disclose a little story. There was a time, 3 young kids, a lot of work, where like I thought we weren't having enough sex in my relationship. And um, my way of kind of initiating was bringing concern to the table. Like, you know what? I've kind of noticed this. I don't like it. It worries me. And in my mind, I was like initiating that connection and that contact, but I was really just bringing a ton of anxiety, which was leading us to have like conversations based on like worry and anxiety. And it was so ineffective. I was like, if what I'm wanting is to increase the frequency of sex, I need to initiate differently, right? Like this doesn't work. So that's kind of like the story I think about behind my question. Like, are you doing it in a way that works? And also, like, I've heard of people that initiate, women will be like, he just comes up to me and slaps my butt while I'm like washing the dishes. Like, I want to slap him back. Like that initiation just doesn't work for your relationship. Try a different one.
So has that been a shift though now in your relationship with kids that has that, has it made it more balanced now moving forward? Or is it easy to sort of go back to the old or
I mean, I think it's easy to get distracted and there's less privacy, which I think for us, it's like a big deal. Like the setting in general, having 3 kids around and just being tired isn't the most conducive as when things were like simpler and it was just the 2 of us. But I think that we have grown up in and matured in our ability to manage it and have these conversations where, again, like if you notice something that you don't like, you know how to bring it up effectively and you know how to bridge that gap without turning it into an anxious process. So I think the circumstances haven't changed recently. We still have the 3 kids. We're planning on keeping them. But like what has changed is our capacity to navigate the moments where you are someone feeling disappointed, or like if you've been rejected, or you feel too responsible for initiating. And you kind of, something we didn't talk about is like you can get tired of constantly asking for it, which then may want you, like you may want to stop. So I think
that's what often happens when I think, you take on these roles of maybe the initiator and the other, the rejector, and it works for a really long time. And then, I would say the initiator probably hits a wall at some point and says, I don't always want to be able, I don't always want to have to make the effort. I'm tired too. And I think especially when you have kids and busy lives and careers, that it takes more effort then. And then you want to say, it would be really nice to have my partner pursue me too, because that also makes me feel wanted and appreciated. Right. And so I think it is good to have variety and to switch it up and to not get stuck in the same role, even if it does work, it may work for a while, may not work forever, but I think it's always good to have some variety.
The effectiveness for your relationship. If it works, no need to change it. But if it doesn't, how can you adapt it? Yeah. What's your other question?
My other question is, what are things you think during sex but don't say? And I just think there's such a dialogue that we have, in our own head, not always, but sometimes, and what are you thinking and not saying, or feeling and not saying? And what, I don't know, maybe it will make you laugh, or maybe it will make your partner laugh if you actually did share some of those things.
Well, and even a little more profound than laughter. I mean, laughter is fantastic. But the thing I was thinking about is that one of the things that may get most in the way of performance and satisfaction in sex are precisely those things that are in our head that we may hear them but not address them, like not notice them. I think you're asking us to notice. What is the message? What is the voice in your head saying? So number one, notice it. And then number two, if you have the guts, I was going to say the balls, but like if you have the guts to address it, and if you do, could that then reduce the anxiety and therefore lead to better performance and satisfaction?
Well, yes, I think my question is also referring to, can there be more open conversations about your sex life? I don't think it's something we do and we engage in, but I'm not sure it's something that we
agree.
talk about so freely and openly, even with our partner. And I mean, I'm not sure how many couples talk so openly and freely about their sex life and what actually happens in the process for the couple as a whole, but also individually. And that there's this whole dialogue inside of us, our thoughts and feelings, even, about our experience of orgasming, or of initiating, of rejecting, that is unspoken. It's sort of this unspoken, implicit contract that we have with our partner that I think would be really beneficial to open up and give it, more music and color and, just.
That's fantastic. Yeah. To me, especially the internal dialogue, because I guess I spend a lot of time talking to people about what happens between them. But I love this focus on what is your internal dialogue? What is your experience like inside your head? Very interesting. I love that.
Great conversation. Thanks, Elsa. Until the next one.
Yes, thank you. This was fun.
Email us with any questions to the Me and Us podcast@gmail.com.
Yep.
Got it right this time.
Those on Instagram, also the Me and Us podcast. All right. Thanks for joining us.
Till next time. See ya. Bye-bye.